Welcome to Tritiyo Matra. Last year, 2020, was the 15th consecutive year that Freedom House reported a decline in the global state of democracy. According to the Economic Intelligence Unit's measure of democracy, only about half of the world's population live in a democracy of some sort. And even fewer reside in a full democracy. More than one-third of the world's population live under authoritarianism rule. While there may be a diversity of opinion on the degree to which the democratic space is shrinking in specific contexts, there is an across-the-board consensus that we are facing the trend of democratic backsliding in many countries in many regions. Is South Asia one of them? What specific challenges we are facing? What opportunities are there to invest in? What lessons have we learned from decades of democracy assistance programs, and where do we go from here? Today's episode, which is the first in a series of 4 shows structured around the themes of the upcoming virtual December Democracy Summit, will attempt at exploring these pertinent questions in the context of South Asia. Today's theme is defending against authoritarianism, to discuss which I have 3 eminent guests with me: Mr. Andrew Wilson, the Executive Director of the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, a US-based nonprofit organization that works to strengthen democracy through private enterprise and market-oriented reform since 1983. Dr. Kim Bettcher, CIPE's Director for Policy and Program Learning, and our very own Professor Dr. Ali Riaz, an expert author on South Asia and a distinguished professor at the Illinois State University, USA. Welcome to the show. I'll begin with a question that I have for all 3 of today's guests. And the question is, in your opinion, as far as the state of democracy is concerned, where do you think where the world is at? Professor Dr. Riaz, I would like to start with you and the state of democracy in South Asia, and then go to our guests from CIPE. Professor Riaz.
Thank you, Zilur. It's a pleasure to be with you and with Kim and Andrew to speak about a very difficult question, in the sense that the situation that we are in globally in terms of democracy is not exactly a very optimistic situation. Globally, as we all know, it has been for past decades and a half, we are witnessing the democratic backsliding quite significantly all around the world. South Asia, for example, I would say the state of democracy in South Asia has been the worst in the past 2 decades, to my understanding. If we take the countries, particularly say India, which has been considered as the largest democracy of the world, or at least until recently, that is how it has been described. But unfortunately, since 2014, and especially since 2019, we have seen the spectacular erosion of democracy under Modi regime. It has been described as an electoral autocracy by varieties of democracy VDEM. Similarly, we have seen it has been listed as partly free by the Freedom House for understandable reason. The institutions are not exactly working as they used to, at least for the first 60, 70 years of Indian independence. If you look at Pakistan, it has always been considered as a hybrid regime where military played a pivotal role. And lately, it hasn't gone away under Mr. Imran Khan. Rather, we are witnessing the increasing influence not only of the military, but also the radical Islamist forces. Recently, the government has come up with an agreement with a militant organization. I would describe it as a militant organization, which seems that the veto power is shifting not only to military, which has been. Now we're adding another element to it, which is not good for democracy. It doesn't reflect good democracy. Sri Lanka, we have seen the majoritarianism, and then Rajapaksa dynasty is in making. It is not democracy. As for your audience, we don't have to speak at length about Bangladesh. They are experiencing 2 consecutive elections, rigged and absolutely unacceptable. Elections have taken place. Not only that, if you look at the laws that have been passed and implemented, have shrunk the democratic space remarkably. Opposition are being persecuted, space for freedom of expression has reached a very low level, and freedom of assembly, we are witnessing that it is almost non-existent. So what I describe as a culture of fear in Bangladesh. For that matter, Maldives. We had great expectation. So I can go by every country. Even Nepal is not showing very much of a positive side. All these things indicate that the state of democracy in South Asia seems to be on a downward spiral, and the democratic backsliding. There is state-led debilitation of the democracy and institution is ongoing, which is very, very, disconcerting. I am really concerned because, as I said, I don't think it has been as bad as in past 2 decades. So that is what I see within the context of South Asia.
Mr. Wilson, do you agree with Dr. Riaz's analysis of the state of democracy, or do you have a more optimistic assessment of the situation? Mr. Wilson.
Well, I certainly can concur with Dr. Riaz's observations of what's going on in South Asia, but I've been in this job for many years, and I think you have to be an optimist to be engaged in democracy support programs. So I'm always at least an idealist when it comes to looking to people for finding their way through when democracy is challenged. But I think we have to admit that there has been a backsliding, if you will, over the last 15 years. I would place the start of the current tests for democracy back at the economic crisis in 2008, when people really started to question the globalist economic model that we've all been prospering under. And also we've seen the rise of even within the region of authoritarian power that can provide growth in the short term, whether it can in the long term. So there have been alternatives that have been coming up that authoritarians and populists have played on to sort of look at people's unhappiness and curtail freedom. The thing about democracy is that it's not an easy system of governance. It's messy. It's hard work. It does deliver in the long run for its citizens, but really it tests, at the best of times, it can test the patience of voters and others. And I think that's really what we're seeing at this point in time, is that in the 2000s and up to the last, even over the last decade, democracy has kind of failed to deliver. Globalization has failed to deliver, especially in my country, but in other places, has failed to deliver prosperity for people. Globalization and culture has felt people feel more alienated from their domestic culture, their home cultures, and it just feeds into this feeling of disconnection, and that feeds back into political discontent, and that's when you see the rise of populists. That's when you see people start to question whether or not their political systems are working well for them. That's when you see the rise of religious extremism. And then what you do see also on the opposite side of this is that authoritarians, some of them in the countries that Dr. Riaz has referred to, are using this to really as an excuse to keep their own corrupt systems alive and floating, and to keep their own crony systems alive and floating, saying, you know what, we need to be homegrown. We need to be focused on our own path to development. Therefore, the path that our country is on is right for our country. And so when you have that happen, immediately what you see is a sidelining of democratic voices, because they are telling people, no, we have to sacrifice, we have to work, we have to keep at this. And when you're feeling as disconnected, and if you're feeling economically challenged, that's not a message you want to hear. You want to hear from people who tell you they have an easy path. And I think people are now starting to see that the easy path perhaps may not be as easy as they thought, and it might actually be destructive. And I think on top of that, we've seen the effect not only of the economic crisis many years ago, but of the COVID crisis. And COVID has also exacerbated, I think, these feelings that people aren't in control of their life, that somehow they've lost control. And that's where populists, that's where authoritarians are able to creep in. And certainly at the big early stages of the COVID crisis, we saw authoritarians put forth a model that seemed to be effectively dealing with with COVID, and our own systems tragically struggled to deal with it. But I think as we look, and part of the reason why I remain an optimist, when we see the resilience of democracies in responding to COVID, as they develop drugs, as they get treatments out, as they're able to restore people's lives to some sense of normalcy with freedom, I think we're going to see people start to look at democracies as being more resilient and as being in the long term, better for their own prosperity and health.
Dr. Bettcher, do these patterns and dynamics described by Dr. Riaz and Mr. Wilson hold true roughly across the board? Are there any outliers to this tide of authoritarianism that one can be hopeful about? Dr. Bettcher.
Yes, there's cause for concern and there's also reason for hope. I think looking at the trends of recent years, there's been an atmosphere of gloom and doom, and I would argue that this has been overstated. You can always find outliers in any direction, and they can get a lot of attention. I mean, the authoritarian successes, like Singapore, has got lots of press, but we sort of focus on one Singapore and ignore the Zimbabwe's of the world or the Venezuelas. In terms of democratic hope, Sudan, we see people, civilians fighting for a new democratic form of government after the military transition to civilian and combined rule. Colombia is still holding on after establishing a peace agreement some years ago with the leftist guerrillas. Every country has its challenges, but they're hanging on. Tunisia remains a symbol of hope for the Middle East region. Nepal, while it's had its constitutional problems and corruption, is significantly freer than it was at the beginning of the century. Moldova has moved in a positive direction. And for context, we have to remember that at the turn of the century, we had unprecedented numbers of democracies around the world that we had never seen in history. And that set a very high expectation, maybe a kind of complacency. Very many of those democracies at the beginning of the century were electoral democracies, maybe illiberal democracies. They were not very well established. They did not have consolidated democratic norms and institutions. And so like in the post-Soviet space or maybe Cambodia, many of these were not very serious democracies to begin with. Similarly, as we see some of the advance of authoritarianism, authoritarians haven't necessarily consolidated their gains. I think Dr. Riaz mentioned hybrid regimes. There's a lot of competitive authoritarian systems where they're kind of stuck in the middle and things are being still played out. So it's not necessarily strong movement towards authoritarianism. And I would point to the resilience of the embrace of democracy around the world. Public opinion polling consistently shows that the majority of people in most countries prefer democracy to other forms of government. We've seen this from Pew Research. We've seen this from the World Values Survey and various democracy barometers. And the numbers of protests around the world are up. And we've seen people come out and protest against corruption. They don't take it anymore. It's no longer embedded in culture. People in Belarus have put on a brave fight. So we've seen a lot of popular protest. And the final thing I would say is that the authoritarian regimes are not always strong as they like to project. They're good at showing that externally that they have ways of getting things done, but they have their own internal challenges. And I think both in terms of their ability to adapt and perform over the long term as innovative economies, and they have a very limited basis of legitimacy.
Dr. Bettcher, CIPE is an organization currently running more than 200 projects in 80 countries across the world. And you led CIPE's Policy and Program Learning Department and must have a wealth of program learning to translate into policy concepts and a variety of policy ideas to put to the test or practice through pragmatic interventions. What are the CIPE's programmatic interventions revealing about challenges facing democracy in today's world?
There are some common challenges, and I think the first thing to note is that there has been steady erosion of democratic institutions. You can call it the death by 1,000 cuts. So we do not see military coups so often anymore. The recent coup in Myanmar is a bit more of an exception these days. What we have is authoritarians who are dismantling the pieces of democracy in a calculated way over time. So attacks on the free media, attacks on the independence of the courts, undermining the quality of the civil service and politicizing, interfering with the public space for non-government organizations or for open electoral processes. So there's that institutional attack, a very slow and steady attack. Inequality is definitely top of people's minds today. And although global inequality has come down and the level of standard of living has increased across the world, inequality within countries has become more pronounced. And we see people who are not really able to access the benefits of globalization and prosperity. And this is leading to people feeling that they don't have a stake in the system, or feeling that there's corruption or that things are rigged against them. So both inequality and the erosion of institutions are together undermining trust. And if you have mobilized people who don't have much trust in the institutions, in their governments, then it's a very unsettled situation. We're concerned about authoritarian learning, both learning from experience and learning from each other. Since sort of the heyday of democracy in the 1990s, authoritarians have changed their game. They're maybe less totalitarian, maybe open more in their economic models, not feeling that they need to produce all the answers, but they found ways to undermine democracy and create doubt and disinformation. And they're playing these democratic style games, right? This is the competitive authoritarianism where they pay lip service to democracy, and they allow elections and they allow some form of opposition to exist, but the freedom isn't there. And then I think from a programmatic point of view, I would say we are often able to support local actors around the world in pursuing their objectives, their policy dreams, their desire to have a voice in the way they're governed, and they create practical reforms, right? And whether it's in infrastructure, getting the lights on, cleaning the streets, or changing the tax system to a more rational and equitable system. And the problem is that a lot of these reforms are on paper. They're not implemented. Implementation gaps have been a crucial problem that CIPE has seen. And so the quality of governance, what happens in the policy space and the enforcement and the execution of policy is really critical. So Kenya had laws that went through like 2012, and earlier to formalize the informal sector, to create more opportunities for micro and small business, to give more people kind of a chance. And they're pretty good laws. They just haven't been enforced. And ultimately, what it comes down to is collective action problems. The majorities of people would benefit from greater economic opportunities, greater opportunities to hold governments accountable collectively. But they have to organize. They have to come together. And that is the trick. If you have divided oppositions, if you have civil society that's that's fragmented, if people can't kind of aggregate their issues, and that's what CIPE works at, right? So building coalitions. Just one example from Nigeria, the Coalition of Nigerian Businesswomen's Associations. Over several years, we've supported a group that now has 52 organizations representing 4 million women in business, and they're successfully pressing their case for access to finance, better security, and less discrimination. So ultimately, it comes down to collective action.
And Mr. Wilson, you have witnessed a CIPE design and implement a democracy assistance program for 25 years, that is two-thirds of its life. How has the nature of opportunities to support democratic governance globally changed through these years, and what lessons can be learned from these shifting dynamics that can help us address the set of challenges to democracy identified by Dr. Bettcher?
Well, certainly, I think that we have seen lots of changing issues through the years that I've been allowed to work on these issues. But I think there's some constants that do emerge out of the end. But if I was to break this down into sort of three phases of reforms that have sort of occurred, or three political phases that have occurred since I began working on these issues back in Eastern Europe in the mid-90s. One would be the post-communist era, where we learned a lot about economic and democratic form. The era of globalization that Dr. Bettcher referred to a little bit, and then finally, I think sort of a post-globalist period, which we've been discussing more frequently. I think that if I go back to the beginning of my time in working on this with the post-communist issues, some of the most interesting times to work, actually, because countries were undertaking both a very complex political transition from a communist authoritarian hybrid model, where they were moving from centralized authority within a communist party to a constitutional authority, and where you had to create institutions of the rule of law, you had to create political parties. There was a lot of work really creating the mechanisms of democracy from whole cloth. And it was a fascinating process to watch as it moved along. And then on the side of economies, what we saw was the dismantling of a centrally planned state system with no market levers in it whatsoever, where the incentives were stood on their head, where you actually got rewarded to waste materials rather than to conserve them, to one in which the market was the primary driving force. And again, a very, very difficult transition and a very traumatic transition, but it taught us a lot about how states can grapple with broader macroeconomic issues, as well as what happens inside businesses and inside firms at the micro level. You've got to remember, this was a time, these state-owned firms, for instance, that were privatized, didn't have accounting standards, they didn't have salespeople, they didn't really even have a management structure that could cope in a market economy. And what we found was that we were having to create these systems without the human capacity, trained people who understood what things should look like, to help things reform. And I think what we learned out of that period was that it was possible to make great strides, but there were also great failures, because people made assumptions about economic reform and democratic transition, that somehow you just had to sort of overnight create a market, just add water, and you would have instant democracy or instant market economy. And we learned pretty quickly that that wasn't so. Kim referred earlier to rule of law issues and governance issues. And what we found was that the lack of the rule of law, the lack of governance institutions, allowed corruption and downright criminal activity to permeate inside of these firms, inside of government, for these elites that were communists to transition themselves into more mafia-like elites, if you will, that tried to control both the economy and the political systems. And in some countries, such as Russia, we've seen that consolidated into a state really based on the interests of people aligned with the security services, where you really don't have any free control of the economy, where the state acts in service to these elites and their economic interests. So we learned out of that period, I think, that we really do need to pay attention to institutions. We do need to pay attention to the rule of law. That second phase of globalization were for many people, and I think many in South Asia, were very good years of robust growth. It was the ascendancy of the global supply chain as multinational corporations began to expand their manufacturing. It was the boom time in China, but also the boom time in Bangladesh, a boom time in India, boom time in Pakistan. And what we saw were these global value chains of multinational corporations beginning to reach into local producers. The markets were expanding within these countries as well. The middle class was expanding within these countries. And we saw it really the development of an international rules-based order. So the rule of law in order to support these multinationals and to help support free competition and free markets, the international rule of law began to become very important. So we saw institutions like the World Trade Organization take a much stronger role. We saw the development of the OECD and other groups that really attempted to make rules for people to behave by when they entered commerce. And there was a general consensus around these issues about how a company should behave, how trade should work, how to govern economies in alignment with these global standards. But we didn't see everything come out as we had hoped, I think, towards that period, because we also saw things like the governance gap that Kim referred to open up. We had global aspirations for rule of law and markets, but in local countries, the local restrictions, the local ability of the local private sector or the regional government in place wasn't there to really support the aspirations of globalization. And so we saw gaps between laws on the books and international commitments and what actually happened in countries. And we also saw, I think, as money began to move around the world in a much quicker and much easier fashion, we started to see the emergence of international corruption and the flow of funds from corrupt countries into Western markets, and often, facilitated, if you will, by laws that were originally created to encourage the development of markets and to encourage the development of firms, to encourage the development of business deals, and they were exploited by the corrupt because they used them instead to hide money, to hide the movement of funds. And certainly in the last few years, we've learned to look for these things, whether it was the Panama Papers that we saw or other scandals where we saw how people were using beneficial ownership to hide the movement of money. We saw the explosion of property markets in cities like London and Miami and New York, where people would take the money because they couldn't keep it safely in their own corrupt countries and invest it in real estate or other projects in places where they could trust the rule of law and develop that. So we started to see sort of the dark side of globalization emerge during this period as well. But I will say the other piece that we do need to point out is digital optimism, that we started to understand that the digital economy, that the internet could provide a space both for civil society and democracy, but also for economies. And it was a period, that period of globalization, I think, was a period of intense optimism about the potential role that social media could play for democracy support, that the way the digital financial transactions could move money, could move goods, could sell goods at a pace never before seen. So there was a lot of optimism about the outcomes that would come from the digital economy, but we hadn't figured out those rules yet. And we still are struggling with that, but we hadn't figured out those rules of the game. And I think that's a shortcoming that came forward in this last stage that we're in right now, or most recent stage, which is this post-globalization period. And in the case of the digital economy, we're seeing now a war of words and a war of deeds over what the internet will look like. How will the internet be governed? With authoritarian states like China and Russia having a sort of surveillance-based model for the internet, and other economies still looking to reach the promise of what the digital economy could have been in that period of globalization. And I think we're seeing a bifurcation of the internet right now along those lines. But really what we saw in the post-globalization was where globalization had failed. And globalization failed, as I mentioned earlier, to really address the needs of the working classes, primarily in the Western economies, when industries relocated to emerging markets and global supply chains became very vital. Democracies, especially in Europe and in North America, failed to address the needs of those being left behind. So it wasn't really a failure of globalization. It was a failure of a domestic response to the challenges that globalization put forth. And I think that's what we see in a lot of places around the world where we've seen strife in societies. It really comes down to the fact that the democratic institutions in these societies were slow to respond. We're slow to pick up the challenge, slow to realize the challenge, and then slow to respond. And that's partly the nature of democracy itself. Democracy is a reactive force often. It waits till a situation has manifested before it can respond. And I think what we saw in this post-globalized period is democracy starting to struggle with it. In our country, the United States, it's very visible. It's been very visible for the last 6 or 7 years, I would say. And we're in the midst of renegotiating our social contract, if you will. And here the tensions in democracy become apparent. But I think also the resilience of democracy becomes apparent. And I would also add, too, this period has been a period where we've seen, as Dr. Bettcher mentioned, the rise of the authoritarian challenge to democracy, to question whether democracy works, to question whether markets work and competition work. And I think that is the point we're finding ourselves at now. We're at a point of conflict.
Professor Riaz, in your opinion, does South Asia have the potential to emerge as a role model in democratic renewal? What are those possibilities at the regional or those anchors at the country level, Professor Riaz?
Before we look into the potential, we need to revisit what we are witnessing and what has happened in South Asia. Perhaps in many ways, it has been the case globally too. I mean, the backsliding that we have witnessed, what are the elements that are significant in case of South Asia? One is the executive aggrandizement, that we have seen how the power has shifted to the executive, practically bypassing, or in some cases, as a pylon, very supportive legislative body. Judiciary's independence have been cut in many cases. India is a case in point where we have seen the judiciary time to time has taken stand, but most of the time it hasn't. Or the media's freedom has shrunk remarkably. So those are the lessons that you'll have to first look into. Dr. Wilson mentioned about the resilience. Yes, I'm optimistic too, that if we look at the past years, decades, what happened? This is the third wave that we are witnessing now has gone. So it is the third reverse wave, let me say. That means on previous occasion, it has bounced back and it will bounce back at some point. So at the end, I am optimistic about the resilience, but unless we learn the lesson, and what are the lessons globally and what are the lessons in case of South Asia? And one other thing that is in case of South Asia that I am, not only South Asia, globally as well, but most importantly in case of South Asia, as we are speaking about South Asia, is the dark cloud I call China, because of its presence. And it is not only, it's not the deep pocket I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about the ideological challenge it has posed to the liberal order. We've been talking about the globalization. One other impact that we cannot simply escape in case of South Asia, that despite the fact that globalization has offered some kind of a boom in economy, GDP has grown, but the inequality has grown enormously. India perhaps demonstrated more clearly. Bangladesh is a case in point, where we have seen. So long this inequality is being produced, there's a likelihood that the confidence on the democratic institution is going to continue to erode. The people's lack of confidence in democratic institutions needs to be restored. When you are talking about the renewal, those are the things that needs to be. On the one hand, those who are in power, the authoritarian governments and those who aspire to be authoritarian and the systems, what they are doing is practically peeling off the democratic institution where they were institutions. In other cases, the democratic institutions were either weak or non-existent. Electoral system, for example. In case of Bangladesh, the entire electoral system seems to be decimated by design. In case of Pakistan, that we have seen that the civil society and the media has been facing enormous challenges. So those are the questions that we need to understand. And practically one of the major elements in order to become if you call it the beacon, if you call it the renewal of global democracy, is this question of economy and inequality question. It's very difficult to bypass that, because one of the reasons that I see is the questioning the very foundation of democracy comes from those who have left on the margin. And here, let me a little bit disagree with Dr. Wilson. The enormous faith that we try to put on the middle class seems to be, at least at this point, I'm not very convinced anymore that the middle class actually promotes democracy. Lately, I've been working on the democracy, the role of middle class. And, take for India, 1990, globalization, rise of the middle class, and the erosion of democracy. Philippines, Turkey, for example, Bangladesh. So having that faith on middle class, the middle class would actually pressure for democracy. We need to revisit that too. Martin Lipset, the political scientist, who suggested that one, or Barrington Wood, for example, no bourgeoisie, no democracy kind of argument, may tend to be fine with the Western world. The erosion of democracy in the United States or Europe, in part, is because of the eroding middle class. But is it also true for Turkey? Is it also true for Bangladesh? Is it also true for the Philippines? I'm not sure. I'm not sure means rather I see the data somewhat differently. That's why, in case of South Asia, for the renewal, we need to look into these, not so obvious elements of it. How globalization has created a permanent underclass. We need to look into it. Globalization has provided some elements of good, but it has also created some problems. And we cannot simply continue the way the globalization has worked. So I am optimistic about resilience. And Dr. Bettcher has mentioned about the collective action. I have no doubt in my mind that that is the only way to go. At the end of the day, I still believe, and I concur with Dr. Bettcher, that, that people, whether it's in India, whether it's in Sri Lanka, whether it's in Bangladesh or Nepal, they want democracy. They want a participatory system where they want a system that is inclusive, both economically and politically. That is the point. We cannot and should not be separating this economic question from the political institutions and the political aspiration. That is where the renewal question is there. That if we want to see a renewal of democracy, the reflection of the aspiration of the people, we need to address both the economic participation and inclusiveness as well as political inclusiveness. It has become inseparable. It has been inseparable, but now it has become more obvious that it's inseparable. And that is where the possibility. Can South Asia do it? Yes, I can. I think it can. India's lesson should be there. Bangladesh, Pakistan. It is possible. It's difficult. As Dr. Wilson has rightly mentioned, the democracy is messy. And it has rebounded, and I am optimistic in the long term. But what we see now is not a very optimistic picture.
Okay, but we are almost at the end of the program, so we don't have enough time. But Dr. Bettcher, what 3-5 policy interventions are absolutely necessary in defending democracies against authoritarianism, and what role does the private sector play in this process? You have 2 minutes, please.
All right, thank you. First, one has to look at the special challenges and opportunities in each country. Don't try to make your democracy become New Zealand or Denmark or Japan or what have you. So Bangladesh is famous for its non-government organizations. It's famous for its economic policies of inclusion. So maybe build on some of the strengths. Democracy has to be an open, competitive system, and that only works with freedom of association. If you don't have the ability of actors to come together, to express their views and organize and hold government accountable, and better political parties are built on better social organizations. So freedom of association. Anti-corruption we've talked about. I would simply say that it's not enough to hunt down the bad actors. One has to transform the system and the incentives and the opportunities. So more competition, more transparency, less discretion. Andrew has alluded to technology and future challenges. One has to focus on governance in particular sectors. What happens between elections? How new models of regulation are developed to address these problems and opportunities will be really important. And I'm a big believer in the processes of public-private dialogue and citizen engagement. You have to create ideas and buy-in from the population, and it's not about policies that come from a technocrat or from an external democracy assistance organization. Dr. Riaz stressed the importance of inclusion. I totally agree. I think entrepreneurship is a good path there. And at the end of the day, so business is a great organizer. Business is innovative. Business can kind of create a lot of space for independent, pluralistic, competitive action in society. That's all great. But at the end of the day, business has to recognize that it depends on democratic norms. If rule of law is challenged, if freedom of information and speech is challenged, it will suffer too. And it has to look ahead and with others in society, stand up and defend democratic norms.
Mr. Wilson, you led an organization with a unique niche and an organization that supports democracy by working with and through the private sector. What in your view are the 3-5 major elements of real leadership by the private sector in inspiring democracies like Bangladesh or across South Asia?
Yeah, well, I think there are
please make it very short.
Sure. I think there are a few key things you've got to think about. We talked about collective action, and I think these organizations like chambers of commerce, business associations are key in that. But these institutions themselves must reflect the democracies that we're working in. And that's often a key shortcoming we see of chambers and business associations, is that they tend to reflect the needs of perhaps the elected leadership of these chambers and associations and do a poorer job of reflecting the overall needs of a business community that is not a monolith, that is broad-based and very diverse. And so I think the better these institutions can do at being transparent, at listening to their membership, at really trying to represent the collective interests of the private sector, the more they can contribute to growth and also, by their example, democracy within a country.
Professor Riaz, as a professor in the United States and an expert on this region, what are your hopes for South Asian democracy and what specific support can the world provide in facilitating that?
In the long run, I'm optimistic. South Asia has proved to have bounced back before. The world will be bouncing back. It may take time. In so far as the particular support from the international community, there can be a long list, but I would emphasize on 4 things the international community should do. Number one is the insistence on rule of law and holding those who have perpetrated or violated the rule of law in some form or other. They should be held accountable, and the international community should make that very clear that anyone violating the rule of law, including persecution or, ranging from extrajudicial killing to God knows what else, So number 2 is the restoration of the electoral system and its integrity. There should be an emphasis whether it's Nepal, Maldives or Bangladesh, that the international community should emphasize on the restoration of a fair electoral system, because that is the first step for inclusion. Not the last one, but you cannot bypass that one. Number 3, addressing the question of corruption, because that has the corrosive impact on the entire system, the crony system, everything that has been stayed there, or continue to be, is because fueled by corruption. So international community should take a stand on the addressing the corrupt factors. 4th one that I would insist is on the civil society. The civil society, including media, there are, in many cases we have seen how the attempts have been made, how the laws have been changed, practically to vilify and criminalize the civil society action. So I think these are the first 4 steps that is absolutely necessary to show by the international community, particularly the United States, in making sure its commitment to democracy would come down to translating into at least these 4 things in an immediate manner. That I have no doubt in my mind. Can we extend that list? Yes, we can. But I think these are fundamental 4 pillars that needs to be done immediately and as practically as soon possible.
Dr. Bettcher, very shortly, how can the U.S. balance its priority of ensuring its global geopolitical interests and democracy in the region, South Asia region?
The United States, like any country, has many interests and many tools at its disposal. And we know that in its efforts to counter authoritarian superpowers or to pursue its economic interests, there will be times when democracy is not at the top of the U.S. foreign policy list, but it's to the U.S.'s long-term benefit to show a consistent stand of support for democratic principles. And I think you're seeing Andrew and myself here representing a piece of an American effort led by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is premised on a whole of society approach to assisting democracy and kind of civil society to civil society relationships across countries. So it doesn't have to be the executive branch of a government alone pursuing a democracy policy. And within the National Endowment for Democracy family, we have labor, we have business represented, we have the Democratic Party Institute and the Republican Party's Institute. And we work with a wide range of actors and constituencies in other countries, including youth and women and economic organizations and political parties and so forth. So I think that this is a good model that we remember that democracy is created by the people in each country and by civil society, and it's not purely a government project.
Thank you. Mr. Andrew, we often see there is security cooperation between the United States of America and some of the undemocratic governments, which helps them to avoid criticism. How do you explain this U.S. approach?
Well, I think, first of all, it is a factor of foreign policy in the United States that there's always this struggle between the idealistic side of foreign policy, which would be our support for Democrats around the world and putting in place a series of support for democracy programs, and those of security and commercial interests. And often that's called in the United States realist foreign policy. And the trick that the United States really must grapple with right now and in terms of its foreign policy is trying to balance out the needs and the desires of realist foreign policy, which really has driven U.S. foreign policy really since the early 70s, and this more idealistic format where we think about our ideals. And I think the trick for the United States is to have a realist foreign policy that does concern the security issues and the commercial interests, but have this sort of idea about democracy at its base. Why are we doing all of this? Why do we have a security policy? Why do we have a strong foreign commercial policy? We do that because we believe ultimately that the success of our own democracy is at stake, and through the success of our own democracy, we can work with other democracies around the world to create this system, this global system of values and practices. And I think that's at the heart of the struggle right now, and that's why you're seeing the Summit for Democracies take on such a visible appearance right now. This administration, I think, is having that discussion and is trying to say, yes, we do need foreign policy that has democracy as a stronger element of it than perhaps we've had in the last 15 years.
Dr. Riaz, it will seem to many that Americans' involvement in the South Asia region currently is very much aligned with the interest of regional superpower India. Do you think there is a benefit in making more room in U.S. foreign policy for the smaller nations of Asia such as Bangladesh instead of viewing their geostrategic importance through the lens of India?
I do. I think that U.S. policy over the last decade or so, focusing more on, I would call the New Delhi-centric approach, has not benefited the region, particularly of democracy quotient, if you see. India is no longer the role model of democracy in South Asia. Unfortunately, it's true. I understand that the U.S. policy has been Washington's approach, and you mentioned in the previous question to Dr. Wilson that it is looking through the security prism. This dichotomy, this binary that has been set in the long run is not exactly right, because in long term, democratic nations are more a safety to the U.S. policy and security of the world order than authoritarianism. In similar fashion, India-centric approach. Understandably, India is seen as the antidote to the Chinese influence. Understand? I'm not going to be, utopian on this. It is, it is very much a very realistic or realist approach to it. But having the India practically a blank check doesn't help promotion of democracy, preserving the democracy in the region. That's why similarly it happened in case if you look at the Afghan policy and having so much dependent on Pakistan, writing blank check for Pakistan for 2 decades didn't help. Putting all your eggs into one basket doesn't help. And given the increasing geopolitical importance of the region, and particularly Bangladesh, since we're talking to the Bangladeshi audience, I think there should be a clear reassessment of the policy. It doesn't have to be through New Delhi. It can be New Delhi on the one hand, and the other countries such as Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, on a different basket. There can be two-track policy and approach that I expect that it should be looked into, and I hope that should be the case, because experience is telling us that it didn't work for the United States, and particularly for democracy in the long run in the region.
Indeed, this was a fascinating discussion. Thank you, Mr. Andrew Wilson, Dr. Kim Bettcher, and Professor Ali Riaz for being with us. President Biden will host a virtual summit for leaders from government, public society, and the private sector on December 9 and 10, 2021. The summit will concentrate on the challenges and possibilities that democracies face, and it will give a forum for leaders to make individual and collective commitments to safeguard democracy and human rights, both at home and abroad. According to Biden's camp, the summit will provide a chance for the United States to listen, learn, and engage with a wide spectrum of players whose support and commitment are important for global democratic renewal. The Biden administration has committed to making democratic assistance a priority in U.S. foreign policy, increasing expectations for a more proactive American involvement in reversing the worldwide democratic decline. To keep this pace, the president must give a strong leadership, clearly stating his intentions to the American people and partners throughout the world. If there is a proper follow-through on the summit's promises, it could become a strong demonstration of how open, rights-respecting communities may collaborate to successfully address today's big issues, including the COVID-19 pandemic, climate catastrophe, and rising inequality. Thank you, viewers. Thank you for being with us.